February 1, 2004 seemed like just another ordinary Sunday in the United States. Millions of people were gathered in front of their televisions to watch Super Bowl 38, where the New England Patriots would face the Carolina Panthers at Reliant Stadium in Houston, Texas. For many, it would be a historic day in sports. But for one family in Sarasota, Florida, that date would become the worst nightmare of their lives. That weekend, 11-year-old Carlie Brucia had spent the night at a friend's house with her mother's permission. Less than an hour before the Super Bowl kickoff, Carlie decided to head home to watch the game with her mother, younger brother, and stepfather. To her, it seemed simple enough. The distance between the two houses was short, about half a mile. Even at just 11 years old, Carlie insisted that she could walk home by herself through the city streets. Her friend's mother even offered to drive her home, but the girl refused and set off alone that Sunday afternoon. The decision left her friend's mother deeply concerned. Just a few minutes after Carlie walked away, she decided to call Susan, the girl's mother, simply to make sure it was okay for her to be walking home alone. But the response came as an immediate shock. Susan said she had never allowed her daughter to walk alone through the streets of Sarasota, a small Florida city with just over 50,000 residents. At that very moment, a worried Susan alerted her husband, Stephen, Carlie's stepfather, who rushed out desperately to look for her along the route. Only a few minutes had passed since she had left her friend's house. In theory, she could not have gotten very far. While most families remained inside watching the Super Bowl, Stephen drove through the streets growing more desperate by the minute. The roads were relatively empty, but Carlie was nowhere to be found, no sign of her and no response. It was as if she had vanished along the way. Just over an hour later, 911 was called, and Carlie Brucia was officially reported missing. The case quickly began drawing the attention of both law enforcement and residents across the entire city. What nobody realized was that this seemingly innocent disappearance, taking place on Super Bowl Sunday, would become one of the most shocking and widely known criminal cases in United States history. How could an 11-year-old girl disappear during such a short walk, in broad daylight, without anyone noticing a thing? And most frightening of all, what happened to her after that moment when she was last seen walking alone through? For millions of football-loving Americans, those minutes before kickoff were filled with anticipation. Parties were already underway, families gathered around their televisions, and the late afternoon and early evening seemed to be unfolding like any other day. But in Sarasota, Florida, the atmosphere was completely different. While the rest of the country prepared to watch the game, police officers and volunteers were beginning a desperate race to find Carlie. Sarasota was considered a quiet city, with just over 50,000 residents, located near the Tampa Bay metropolitan area, a region home to millions of people. Known for its beaches, its international airport, and the famous Ringling Museum, the city rarely experienced cases that shook the community so deeply. Carlie Jane Brucia had lived in Sarasota since she was very young. Born in Long Island, New York, she moved to Florida with her mother shortly after her parents' separation, while she was still a small child. Sometime later, her mother remarried, and the family grew with the arrival of a younger brother. At school, Carlie was known as an energetic and incredibly charismatic girl. She attended McIntosh Middle School, where she was in the 6th grade, and was remembered for the kindness she showed to everyone around her. Friends and teachers described her smile as something impossible to ignore. She loved music, sang in the school choir, and also enjoyed sports. To those who knew her, Carlie seemed to be exactly the kind of person who could light up any room she entered. Because of that, Carlie's disappearance completely shook the city. Within hours, the case had become the main topic of conversation throughout Sarasota. Police immediately began searching for answers, contacting friends, neighbors, and anyone who might have seen something that evening. Houses were visited one by one as investigators tried to reconstruct the girl's final movements before she vanished. Investigators also interviewed the friend at whose house Carlie had spent the day and the night, as well as the girl's mother. According to their accounts, Carlie did not seem to be completely okay emotionally. Shortly before going to her friend's house, her mother and stepfather had argued, and that apparently left her upset. For that reason, she wanted to return home early to be close to her mother. Even though someone could have given her a ride, Carlie insisted on going by herself and did not want her stepfather to come pick her up. But there is one detail in this case that still raises questions to this day. Why didn't anyone stop that young girl from walking home alone? Why didn't they call her mother beforehand to make sure everything was okay? Although Sarasota was considered a safe city, it was Super Bowl Sunday. The streets were busy, there was plenty of activity everywhere, and it would be completely dark before long. Looking back on it now, it is impossible not to wonder what might have happened differently. What about you? If you had been in that situation, would you have allowed your daughter's friend to walk home alone? Leave your opinion in the comments. Meanwhile, as the hours passed, the concern only grew. Search teams continued looking for Carlie throughout the entire night. Police officers searched streets, vacant lots, and areas near where she had last been seen. But even after hours of intensive searching, there was still no sign of her. When morning arrived, after an entire night without answers, investigators decided to bring in tracking dogs in an effort to find any trail that might reveal where Carlie had gone. The investigators gave the dogs one of the pillowcases Carlie had used at her friend's house, hoping the scent would help reconstruct her route that night. The dog followed the trail through the streets of Sarasota until reaching the rear of a car wash on Bee Ridge Road, one of the busiest roads in the city. It was there that the scent disappeared completely. The area was immediately secured by police. Officers then spoke with the owner of the business, Mike Evanoff, who revealed an extremely important detail. The property had motion-activated security cameras. Investigators began reviewing the footage. One camera showed only the busy roadway and an empty parking lot. Another, positioned from a different angle, also appeared to reveal nothing suspicious. But when they examined the camera installed behind the car wash, everything changed. The footage captured the moment Carlie walked past the location shortly after 6 o'clock that evening on the night she disappeared. Seconds later, a man appeared in the video. He was approximately 5 feet 7 inches tall, had dark hair, and visible tattoos on one of his arms. He was wearing a mechanic's uniform with a name tag attached to his chest, but the image quality was too poor to make out the name. The man approached Carlie, and the two appeared to exchange a few words. He then grabbed the girl's arm and led her out of the camera's view. The video lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to completely change the course of the investigation. At that moment, detectives realized they were no longer dealing with a simple missing person case. To everyone involved, it became clear that Carlie was in serious danger. Carlie's stepfather, Stephen, was also brought to the police station for questioning. During his interview with investigators, he said he immediately knew something was wrong because Carlie would never disappear without telling someone. According to him, she always called her parents to let them know where she was and what she planned to do. Police reviewed Stephen's phone records and timeline, and before long he was eliminated as a suspect. However, during the interview, he mentioned one detail that caught the detective's attention. While driving along Bee Ridge Road searching for Carlie, Stephen noticed a red pickup truck repeatedly moving through the area. Later, when he arrived at the house where Carlie had spent the night, he saw the same truck parked in front of a nearby residence. He was certain it was the same vehicle. Investigators discovered that the truck belonged to a man named Ron, who lived directly across the street. Coincidentally, Ron worked as a tow truck operator and wore a uniform very similar to the one worn by the man seen in the car wash security footage. Based on the information provided by Stephen, police decided to bring him in for questioning immediately. During the interview, detectives asked detailed questions about Ron's whereabouts on the Sunday Carlie disappeared. He carefully described his activities throughout the day. Investigators then showed him the security footage from the car wash, which captured the moment Carlie was led away by the unidentified man. Ron denied being the person in the video. He admitted there might be some resemblance, but insisted that it was not him. Police then contacted Ron's employer, who confirmed that he had indeed been working at that time. Time records supported his account. In addition, investigators conducted a thorough search of his truck, but nothing suspicious was found. Without any evidence linking him to the disappearance, Ron was eliminated as a suspect. But that meant investigators still had no idea who the man in the footage was, or where he had taken Carlie. The recordings were also shown to Susan, the girl's mother. However, she did not recognize the man. For the Sarasota community, the situation was terrifying. The abduction had taken place in broad daylight, with people moving around less than 300 feet from the scene. In an effort to generate new leads, authorities announced a reward of $25,000 for any information that could help identify the kidnapper. Meanwhile, investigators returned to the security footage and began analyzing it frame by frame. That was when they noticed something important. After rewinding the recording, they spotted a yellow 1992 Buick entering the car wash parking lot just 3 minutes before Carlie's abduction. The vehicle slowed down directly in front of the location before pulling into the property. For the first time since the disappearance, police believed they had found a concrete lead. The search continued throughout Sarasota. Volunteers began combing through streets, vacant lots, and nearby neighborhoods, while posters displaying Carlie's photograph were distributed across the entire city. The community was determined to help in any way possible. The mayor even publicly declared that Carlie had become Sarasota's child, stating that the entire city would remain mobilized until she was found. Shortly afterward, Susan appeared before cameras during a press conference and made an emotional plea for her daughter to be returned safely. On February 3, 2004, 2 days after the disappearance, a woman was watching the news when the car wash footage appeared on television. She immediately called her husband. The two watched the recording carefully and came to the same conclusion. They knew that man. According to her, the suspect had once been her co-worker at an auto repair shop. Even though the footage was of poor quality, there were details that were impossible to ignore. The way he walked, his haircut, his sneakers, and even his posture all seemed far too familiar. At that moment, while watching the abduction footage, she became certain of who she was looking at. Without wasting any time, her husband immediately called the police and provided investigators with the man's name and address. After receiving the name of the possible suspect, investigators headed straight to the address. When they arrived at the residence, they knocked on the door several times, but no one answered. Even so, a neighbor claimed to have seen movement inside the house shortly before police arrived. The officers remained at the location waiting for some kind of response. Meanwhile, one of the detectives contacted the Sarasota Police Department to gather more information about the man they were looking for. That was when they discovered that he was on probation and had already committed 2 previous probation violations without being sent back to prison. Given the circumstances, the detectives decided to contact the probation officer responsible for supervising him and asked her to come to the residence. Nearly 45 minutes later, the probation officer arrived at the property. Shortly after she got there, the resident finally decided to open the door. It was Joseph Peter Smith, a 37-year-old man from Brooklyn and the father of 3 daughters. Joseph's criminal history immediately caught the investigators' attention. Since the 1990s, he had been arrested multiple times for offenses involving illegal drug possession and fraud related to controlled medications. In one case, he served more than a year in prison, and only days after his release, he was arrested again for additional drug-related offenses, receiving 3 years of probation. In addition, his past included serious accusations, among them kidnapping and false imprisonment, although he was acquitted in that case. Shortly before Carlie's disappearance, he had also violated the terms of his probation but was released once again. He lived alone in that house, which he had rented after a divorce several years earlier following his ongoing legal troubles. There was another detail that investigators found suspicious. On that specific day, Joseph had failed to show up for work at the auto repair shop where he was employed. To investigators, it seemed increasingly likely that they had finally found the man responsible for Carlie's disappearance. Now their hope was to discover where the girl was and perhaps find her still alive. During the visit, detectives directly asked Joseph where he had been on the day of the disappearance and whether he had been near the car wash. He denied it, saying he had never been there at any point that day. One of the investigators then asked to take a closer look at the tattoos on his arms. Joseph wanted to know why he was being asked so many questions, and the officers explained that they were investigating the abduction of a young girl. When investigators showed him the images taken from the security cameras, Joseph looked at the photograph for a few seconds before responding. According to him, the man did resemble him, but he insisted that he was not the person seen in the footage. Despite the tension of the situation, Joseph remained calm throughout the conversation. He gave officers permission to search his house and also allowed them to inspect his vehicle, a brown Lincoln. However, the car seen near the car wash in the footage was a yellow 1992 Buick, completely different from the vehicle found at the residence. Even while surrounded by suspicion, Joseph appeared relaxed and cooperative as investigators worked to determine whether they had finally found Carlie's abductor. During the search of Joseph's residence, investigators found a mechanic's uniform similar to the one seen in the security footage. Even so, there was no sign of Carlie inside the house. No clothing, personal belongings, or any evidence suggesting that the girl had ever been there. During the search of his vehicle, however, officers discovered illegal substances. As a result, Joseph was immediately arrested for once again violating the terms of his probation. While officers were examining the brown Lincoln parked on the property, a woman named Naomi, the owner of the house Joseph rented, arrived at the scene driving a yellow Buick that closely matched the vehicle captured by the car wash cameras. At that moment, investigators realized that the car they had been searching for might literally be right in front of them. When questioned by police, Naomi confirmed that she owned the Buick. When asked whether Joseph had used the vehicle on February 1, she answered yes. According to Naomi, Joseph had borrowed the car that afternoon and did not return it until Monday morning. The information only intensified the suspicion surrounding him. Joseph was questioned again about Carlie's whereabouts, but he continued to deny any involvement. After some time, he decided to stop answering questions and stated that he would only speak in the presence of an attorney. Shortly afterward, he was officially transported to the Sarasota Police Department on charges related to the drugs found during the search. Meanwhile, the yellow Buick and the mechanic's uniform were sent for forensic examination. On the night of February 4, detectives called John, Joseph's brother and co-worker at an auto repair shop, in for questioning. John explained that the two had not been getting along very well in recent months. According to him, on the night of Carlie's disappearance, Joseph called him at around 8 o'clock in the evening. The conversation seemed completely normal, with nothing that stood out at the time. But everything changed the following day. At the repair shop, John noticed that his brother's behavior was unusual. Joseph kept washing his hands repeatedly, even when they were already completely clean. At one point, he also mentioned to his boss that he might need to leave the state at any moment. That evening after returning home from work, John said he was watching the news with his girlfriend when footage of the abduction appeared on television. As soon as he saw the video, he immediately recognized several familiar details: the face, the hair, the uniform, and especially the way the man walked. After undergoing back surgery, Joseph had developed a distinct gait, something both John and his girlfriend noticed right away in the footage. Later that same night, Joseph unexpectedly showed up at his brother's house. According to John, he appeared to be under the influence of drugs or some other substance. John refused to let him inside. He told investigators that on previous occasions, Joseph had displayed behavior that he considered inappropriate around his girlfriend's teenage daughter, which only increased his suspicions. Another detail caught his attention during that visit. Although Joseph was wearing his mechanic's uniform as usual, he was not wearing his usual sneakers. Instead, he was wearing boots, something that was unusual for him. Since he was not allowed inside, Joseph left a short time later. During his statement, John made it clear that he had no concrete evidence against his brother. Even so, he could not ignore the fact that the man in the footage looked remarkably similar to him. The detectives knew they needed either a confession or some definitive piece of evidence if they were going to find Carlie in time. But John offered a troubling warning. According to him, if Joseph really was responsible, he would never admit to the crime. He would take it to the grave. With every passing hour, more evidence seemed to point toward him. The vehicle, the uniform, and other items continued to be examined by forensic specialists while investigators raced desperately against the clock. Carlie was still missing, and Joseph remained silent in front of investigators. Even while surrounded by suspicion and increasingly strong evidence, he refused to help police uncover what had happened to the girl. But everything changed the day after his arrest. On February 5, 2004, Joseph was granted permission to make a phone call. On the other end of the line were his mother and his brother. The conversation lasted about an hour and a half. And it was during that phone call that Joseph finally admitted the truth for the first time. He confessed to his mother and brother that he had abducted Carlie. But what came next shattered any remaining hope. Joseph also revealed that Carlie was already dead. The confirmation devastated Carlie's family, the investigators, and the entire Sarasota community. For days, volunteers and law enforcement officers had held on to the hope of finding the girl alive. But at that moment, it became clear that the outcome would be far more tragic than anyone had imagined. During the phone call with his mother and brother, Joseph Smith confessed that he had sexually assaulted Carlie and then killed her by strangulation. Shocked by the confession, Joseph's brother immediately provided authorities with the directions Joseph had given about where the body could be found. Search teams traveled to an area covered by dense vegetation located behind a Mormon church. That was where they found Carlie. The scene was devastating. The girl's body was partially unclothed, with one leg extended while the other remained bent underneath her body. She still had a sock on her right foot. Investigators also observed deep marks on her neck that were consistent with strangulation. The autopsy conducted by the Sarasota County Medical Examiner's Office revealed important details about Carlie's final moments. According to forensic experts, she had been strangled from behind. Marks and abrasions found on her body indicated that the victim had been dragged to the location where she was ultimately left. Meanwhile, forensic testing began to reinforce the confession and definitively link Joseph Smith to the crime. Biological material found on Carlie's clothing matched his genetic profile. Investigators also discovered strands of the victim's hair inside the yellow Buick that Joseph had been using during the days surrounding her disappearance. In addition, several fibers recovered from the vehicle matched the clothing Carlie had been wearing that afternoon. During the investigation, police learned that Joseph had disposed of the girl's belongings at different locations throughout the city. Her backpack and several items of clothing were discarded in separate trash containers in an attempt to make the investigators' work more difficult. With the confession, the physical evidence, and the laboratory results all pointing in the same direction, prosecutors considered the case virtually impossible to dispute. Joseph Smith was convicted on all charges related to the abduction, sexual assault, and murder of Carlie Brucia. In March 2006, he was sentenced to death. Over the following years, his legal status went through multiple appeals and changes. At one point, the sentence was reduced to life imprisonment, but it was later restored as a death sentence. Before any execution could take place, Joseph died on death row in July 2021, apparently from natural causes. Even after his conviction, investigators continued examining his background. Some detectives believed he could have been connected to other unsolved crimes in Florida, although those suspicions were never conclusively proven. Carlie's murder also sparked a strong public reaction. Public outrage led to proposals aimed at strengthening the monitoring of convicted sex offenders on probation. One of those initiatives became known as Carlie's Law. Although it received support from various groups, the proposal ultimately did not advance to final approval. But perhaps one of the most tragic consequences of this case occurred far from the courtroom. Carlie's death devastated her family emotionally. In the years that followed, her mother faced a painful struggle with grief and substance addiction. Close friends reported that she never fully recovered from the loss of her daughter, leading her to seek comfort in drugs. In 2017, more than a decade after the crime, she died from a drug overdose, bringing to an end a life marked by the pain left behind by that tragedy. The case of Carlie Brucia remains one of the most shocking criminal cases in Florida history. A girl known for her bright smile, joyful personality, and kindness toward others had her life taken in a brutal way. At the same time, the case demonstrated the importance of community involvement, surveillance technology, and determined investigative work in identifying dangerous criminals. Even after many years, Carlie's name continues to be remembered not for the crime she suffered, but for the person she was. A young girl full of dreams, loved by everyone around her, who left a lasting impact on the lives of those who knew her. If you made it this far, subscribe to the channel to follow other true stories that changed entire communities and altered lives forever. And now, click on the next video appearing on your screen. We have another remarkable investigation waiting for you.